Hello again, everyone. So now for the third and final part of our discussion of compounds. So as we've learned before, the first part was sort of a basic discussion of what compounds are. The second part was a discussion about what the standard stress pattern was, right? The first element receiving primary stress, the second receiving secondary stress, as in train station, right? You can hear the train, first element receives primary stress, station receives secondary stress, and the other word we saw was blackbird, right? So black receives primary stress, and bird receives secondary stress. Okay. Now notice that this can already be thought of as an exception insofar as in normal words, when I say normal words, let's just say words that aren't compounds, we never have secondary stress after primary stress, right? That was sort of one of our golden rules for determining the stress pattern. Once we determine where primary stress is, we've always been able to say that the following syllables, right, will never be stressed. For example, if I look at a word like station, right, we've seen primary stress is on the penultimate syllable, stay, right, and then shun will not be stressed. That's why we write 1 0 indicating that we have a non-stressed syllable, because that is what normally happens in a word, right? Once we have primary stress, the following syllables are not stressed. And what we've just seen when we have a compound such as blackbird, we have blackbird, right? That syllable that follows the primary stress, right, bird, will receive secondary stress. So that, in a sense, contradicts everything we've seen up until now, right? So we can sort of say the general rule for determining secondary stress, right, does not apply in compounds as far as the syllables following primary stress are concerned. Okay. So now we're going to look at, I would say, exceptions as concerning what we might call the normal stress pattern for compounds. So the normal stress pattern is what we can call the 1-2 stress pattern, right? Blackbird 1-2, right? Train station 1-2-0. Okay. Meaning 2-0 meaning the secondary element station receives secondary stress. Okay. So the exception to this is when the stress pattern is reversed. We have 2-1 instead, right? So, we can kind of regroup there. We're going to look at sort of 4 cases that we can reduce to 2 types, right? So the first case is going to have when we have something to do with numbers. I'll just write sort of numbers. Once again, this is on page, 40, I think, of our brochure, and you can find these examples in the brochure. So an example could be, I can say, I'll say like a 2-story building. No, I'm sorry. The building is 2 stories. Here we have the building is 2 stories, or 2-storied. So here in this case, the building is 2 stories. So 2 stories is a compound, right? It's mixed together. And I'm sorry, the handwriting is not so clear. I'm writing with this. It's not quite the easiest way to do this. So, and I'm hoping that this is, yes, clear in this way. So notice here's our compound 2 stories. And the normal pattern, which is 1-2, is reversed 2 stories because we have a number, okay? And we could say, for example, this street, I would say une rue à sens unique. We're going to say this street is one way, right? We're not going to say this street is one way, right? We're going to say this street is one way, okay? So that's one sort of exception. Now now we have 3 other exceptions, and we can kind of think of them as being similar insofar as there's something kind of verbal going on here. In a way, I could sort of say something kind of almost adverbial. That might be going too far. The first example of this is when we have what we call compound participles, and this goes along with one of the examples we've seen with the hyphen in the first video. So I could say something like he's broad-shouldered, and this is actually very useful for enriching, I would say, your vocabulary as far as being able to especially describing bodies. Like say he's broad-shouldered, right? Okay. Now this is what we call a compound past participle. Now it's actually what we call a fake participle. For example, we have broad. That would say il a des épaules larges. Il a des épaules larges. He's broad-shouldered. So here, notice what I call this a compound because there's two elements, participle, and the participle is going to be shouldered. Now it's actually, to be more specific, we should say that it's a fake participle, because shoulder, you're all aware, is a noun, right? And we make it sort of behave like a past participle, right? And adding this ed, right, which would be the participle form in a regular verb, right? So, and we do this very often in English when we describe the parts of the body. For example, I could say someone is very long-necked, right? Okay, I could say that someone who has short arms this person is short-armed, right? And so in all of these cases, we're going to have a reversal of the traditional form, right? He's very short-armed, she's very long-legged. We could say that someone is, I would say, la taille une taille de guêpe. On dit la taille, oui, qui a une taille de guêpe, ouais, would be very thin-waisted, okay? So there's a lot of examples of, I could say someone is very thick-wristed, right? So this should really help you out as far as describing, bodies. So broad-shouldered is the reversal of the standard pattern, meaning we're going to have broad will receive secondary stress and shouldered primary stress. Broad-shouldered. Okay. So that's the first example in what we call sort of a compound participle. The second example occurs when we have a compound behaving as and so that's why I said it's verbal, because a participle is sort of a verbal element. So the second verbal case will be when we have the compound that behaves as an adverb. So I could say something like, he fell head first. Okay, so right, head first. So once again, you can kind of hear where the primary stress falls in head first, right? We don't say head first. We don't say he fell head first. We'll say he fell head first. So here we go. Oh, I see. Head, secondary stress, first, primary stress. So once again, a reversal of that 1-2 stress pattern. Here we have 2-1. Okay. Now, I said that this is a compound, right? These words are grouped together, right? And they're describing the way that the person fell. How did he fall? He fell. In what way did the person fall? Well, they fell in a head-first way. That's a sort of a little bit of a cumbersome way to sort of, I would say, to expand on what we mean. So I would say, just to remind you what we learn about this, right, in grammar, we would call that an adverbial, or some people might call it, you might have heard this referred to as an adjunct by other, I would say, grammarians. But in traditional grammar, we're going to call this an adverbial. Now in French, it's going to be, you're very familiar with this because you've done a very good job in learning your complément circonstanciel, right? So en français, ça va être un complément circonstanciel de manière. Donc ça décrit la manière dont quelqu'un est tombé. Je dirais, cette personne est tombée, je ne sais pas, je dirais la tête en premier. So here we have, this person has fallen head first, right? So all this to say is, when a compound plays an adverbial role, right? Okay, complément circonstanciel, the tendency will be reversed. So that, once again, that is the other verbal subcategory. And now there's a final one. I know that this is a little bit laborious. I have to admit, if you can remember all of these cases, then you are doing well. And if you really would like to know, there are even more exceptions, but we are not concerned with those. If you wanted to learn all the exceptions to compounds, you would have a lot of work to do. So it might not seem like it, but we really are simplifying. So here we are. This is the last example in our third video of the 3 verbal types of exceptions as far as compounds are concerned. So now the third case is also verbal, right? And in this case, it happens when the first element is an adverb for the second element. Now, I'll give you an example. It could be something like, and this, by the way, is more obvious in British English than American English. I feel like it's a little bit unnatural for an American speaker to say this, but I could say that someone underachieved. So underachieved. So here we have 2 elements, under and the first element, achieved, is the second element, right? I would say, je crois qu'on parle de la sous-performance, okay? So notice, to achieve is sort of to perform, we can say, and under is describing the way that the person performed. So once again, this is an adverbial part. Now, in the preceding example, both elements together functioned as an adverbial, whereas in this element, we can say this first element, right, functions as an adverbial to the second element. So it's a similar case, and what is going to happen will be that the general pattern will be reversed. Now, I made a mistake in writing under. It's going to be 2O for under, right, and O1 for achieved, right? So those are the exceptions, and to be honest, I wouldn't be overly concerned about this. I don't expect you to know off the top of your head all the cases where we have exceptions, but this is sort of for the excellent students who really want to be on top of things. It would be better to really feel sure about the normal stress pattern, right? Be able to identify a compound, right, which is not so obvious, right? And also to be able to kind of hear and replicate the stress pattern, that 1-2 stress pattern in a compound, and that's sort of the normal one, right? And then also to be to go farther, to be aware of the fact that there are certain cases where that tendency is reversed. Now, I'm going to say one last really nasty thing, which is going to be that in a lot of cases, right, the reverse stress pattern will be flipped around again to have the normal stress pattern if they directly precede a word that is stressed. I'll have to give an example of this. Now, for example, here we have broad-shouldered. I can say he's broad-shouldered, right? And there's no word after shouldered, right? He's broad-shouldered. That is the end of the tone unit, right? So there would be a pause afterwards. So there was sort of no competition between syllables for stress. Remember, we refer to this as stress clash. Now, if you remember, we said that the basic sound pattern of English is what we call the alternating stress pattern, right? That's why we studied poetry, on either side, the riv or lie, right? We have this sort of sing-song aspect because we go sort of not always completely systematically, but a general tendency to kind of go back and forth between a stressed and a non-stressed syllable, right? So that's what we did on either side, the riv or lie. Long fields of barley and of rye that clothe the world and meet the sky. And that's Alfred Lord Tennyson, The Lady of Shalott, right? And we could do all this stuff, right? And that should hopefully help your ear for poetry. And we learned about that, right? That was the thing we saw in the first, second, and third week of this class. And the same thing applies when we have compounds and we have, after the compound, we'll have primary stress. Right? We want to avoid a succession of 2 primary stresses. So here we can see that in normal situation, the compound will be reversed. Namely, this person is very broad-shouldered. Right? You can hear that shoulder receives primary stress, whereas broad receives secondary stress. Right. But if I were to put broad-shouldered before primary stress, right, we would have what we call stress clash. Shoulder, primary stress, right, immediately followed by a noun. And that means that the 2-1 will revert to the 1-2 stress pattern. So I'll need to give an example. So we can say, instead of saying he's broad-shouldered, right? Let's say we have a broad-shouldered man, right? And we can hear it. Instead, here we have broad-shouldered, but we have a broad-shouldered man, right? Because we want to avoid the stress clash between shouldered and man. It would be extremely unnatural to say a broad-shouldered man, right? That juxtaposition of two primary stresses is unnatural. Once again, because of what we call the alternating stress pattern in English, right? And that's why poetry sounds the way it does. So just keep that in mind. And that, I admit, is sort of the painful turn of the screw to these already somewhat complicated exceptions, where we have the normal stress pattern for compounds being 1-2 is reversed, right? The first case being when we have a number in the compound. The second case being where we have those three examples of these sort of verbal compounds, right? So this 2-1 stress pattern, which is exceptional, right, reverts to the standard stress pattern when we have a stress syllable immediately following the compound. Okay, so thank you for following that to the end, and that is the end of our lesson on compounds. I wish you a good week. Good luck in riding it out for our little quarantine period. Best of luck. Take care.